Good morning, everybody. We'll call the Committee of the Whole meeting to order. This meeting will be conducted in person and via conference call in accordance with the Municipal Government Act, Section 199. Council chambers is open to members of the public while continuing to use current telecommuting processes in place. To join the meeting via teleconference, there's a phone number on the agenda. We have an agenda before us. Does anybody have any additions or changes? If not, a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Also move.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. All in favor? Oh, actually, is Councillor Clausen on the line? Okay, we can
I'm here.
By roll call. Councillor Laprise.
In favor.
Councillor Bigger.
In favor.
Councillor Eichert.
In favor.
Reeve Link is in favor. Deputy Reeve Clausen.
In favor.
Councillor Kister.
In favor.
Councillor Laverson.
In favor.
Motion is carried. We have CIBC representatives James Hobson and Sharat Shahal. I believe they're joining us virtually this morning to give us an update, an economic update. Good morning.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Good morning and welcome. Good morning and welcome. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, we are. We have a presentation here. Just want to make sure everybody can see it.
You bet. Our administration have it pulled up in our council chambers.
Perfect. So we're ready to go, or?
Perfect. Take it away.
Okay, thank you all very much for having us back. So we're here today to give you a bit of an update on the economic side. Quite a bit has kind of come to fruition since we last kind of gave you an update. The good news is we were kind of on the right path. We're just kind of starting to see the impact of this kind of economic cycle start to play out. So we're going to walk you through kind of how we got here and where we see things going forward. So just an agenda. So we're going to talk about inflation, obviously a hot topic for everybody. The impact to your municipality with the impact of higher interest rates on investments and lending. We'll give you a growth forecast for Alberta. Chart will touch briefly on commodities, and then we'll end with housing and construction. So we'll start by looking back. I think when we last met with you guys, this was kind of all just happening at the time. More than 40 central banks hiked interest rates by 0.75% at once since over the last year and a half. So obviously, unless you've been living under a rock, we've seen the Bank of Canada raise rates from 0.25% all the way up to 5% today. Has pretty significant impacts for municipalities, and we're going to kind of walk you through our thoughts on that. But this just basically shows it's not a Canada problem, it's not a US problem, it's a global problem that we've been through. So not surprisingly, in the last year and a half, interest rates jumped by more than any full year on record. So all the way back to 1962, we've never seen this happen. So we've truly lived through an unprecedented time, particularly over the last 6 months. And this just shows you the 10-year bond yield, just to illustrate that in 2022, the biggest surge we've ever seen. Now, in terms of implications for what we do as the investment managers for the county, our investment revenue should materially increase over the coming years. It's going to take a bit of time as we reinvest these maturities and cash flows at higher interest rates. But to put it in perspective, a year and a half ago, we were struggling to get 2.5% on a bond. Now we can get between 5 and 7% on fully guaranteed MGA compliant investments. So much more favorable investment environment out there. Conversely, it obviously impacts your lending rates. And we'll give you our forecast in terms of how we view things on that front going forward. And just to kind of graphically illustrate what I just talked about, this shows you the interest rate on 10-year bonds, which kind of drives the investment returns, and the 2-year bonds, which is kind of your cash rates. I'll just point out a couple things here. Firstly, obviously, you can see how dramatic this spike has been. And then I just want to point out that in the middle of last year, we saw what was called yield curve inversion. Essentially, what this means is that the rates on 10-year bonds are actually lower than the rates on cash. Now, what is the market telling us there? Well, market participants would rather lock in a lower interest rate for longer than be subjected to what we call reinvestment risk. So reinvestment risk is the key challenge in what we do, in that we want to lock in these high rates before the forecast is for rates to come down, and we'll walk you through that. Now, why did this happen? Well, it was to fight inflation that wouldn't go away. We kind of addressed this at the last presentation we did to you guys. Inflation in Alberta, 6.5% last year, and we're going to walk you through our forecast. But the key thing to remember as a council is that inflation is just a rate of change. So just because inflation's coming down does not mean prices are coming down. They're just going up at a slower rate. So that's what we've been through. So where do we see things going forward? This is kind of the more important piece. Here's the good news. Inflation in Canada, as kind of forecast last time we were here, is easing quite rapidly. It's come down. The latest national print was in the low 3% range, but we're still higher than the Bank of Canada's target of 2%. The good news is there are tools that can get us back down to that 2% target, which I'll walk you through in a moment. But the other key here is that Canadian inflation is easing much faster than our peers, particularly in the US, and I'll walk you through why. So this graph looks complex. It's really not. This just breaks down inflation into supply-driven inflation and demand-driven inflation. Now, the supply inflation is that blue line, which you can see spiked pretty materially just following the pandemic. This is inflation that's contributed by things like shipping bottlenecks, supply chain issues, delays in manufacturing, all of that stuff led to pretty rampant inflation. Now, the problem with supply chain inflation is we can't do anything about it. That's just what is happening in the market, and central banks cannot impact that type of inflation. The key on this slide is that blue line has come all the way back down to pre-COVID trends, which means we've gotten the supply chain issues out of the system. And now what's remaining is that black line, the demand-driven inflation. The nice thing here is that demand-driven inflation can and is impacted heavily by the impact of rising interest rates. So that's why we're seeing overall inflation come down quite rapidly. Now, how have Canadian households fared during these much higher interest rates? I think it's important to kind of walk you through what's happening out there in the real world to get a sense of what we think the Bank of Canada is going to do over 2024. Now, this just shows you on the left there the excess personal deposits. So during the pandemic, most Canadians actually ended up saving money. We couldn't travel, couldn't eat out, so bank balances were pretty inflated relative to pre-pandemic trends. What we've seen over the last year is that those extra savings have been eaten up pretty rapidly by higher inflation and higher interest rates. So your constituents are starting to feel it. Similarly, on the credit balances on the right-hand side, we're seeing Canadians dip into their credit card balances and their revolving debt lines. They weren't doing it during the pandemic, but they're rapidly dipping into those excess resources to kind of keep up with inflation, keep up with high interest rates. So why is this the case? Why is it so dramatic this time around? This just shows you the rising effectiveness of monetary policy in Canada. So kind of comparing the environment we've just been in to the late 1980s rate hiking cycle. Now, for those of you that remember that hiking cycle, it was a pretty dramatic rise in rates of about 6.5%. Now, that sounds worse than today, but if you actually adjust that for the amount of debt Canadians have, this current cycle is more punitive than that period of time. So on the right there, it shows you the negative impact. Again, we're trying to impact the demand side of that inflation. This shows you the negative impact of each 1% increase to consumer spending. And right now, it's never been more effective, which is good news for the central banks because it means those higher interest rates will start to work, and they are working. But essentially here, if you raise rates by 1%, consumer spending falls by 2%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you raise rates by almost 5%, you're taking essentially 10% of consumer spending, which is the driver of the economy, off the table, which is huge. So the U.S. is a bit of a different story. Their inflation print came out this morning, slightly higher than expected. So this kind of builds into our thesis that the US is going to start cutting rates later than in Canada. The reason being is their economy was way more overheated than in Canada throughout the pandemic until now. This just shows you the change in contribution to growth for things like goods spending, services spending, business investment. It was all very overheated. So if you're trying to time what the US Fed will do, they probably won't start cutting rates. The updated forecast this morning is until the end of next year. And okay, so our forecast, which Chart will walk you through in a nutshell, is that the Bank of Canada has inflicted enough pain on the economy to slow it down quite substantially, and these high rates are not sustainable. This slide kind of illustrates why that's the case. I'll highlight just one bar there. By the end of 2024, 60% of Canadian mortgages will be subject to higher payments. So in the US, they can lock into 30-year mortgages, so they're much less sensitive. But in Canada, many of us have variable rate mortgages or 5-year resets. 60% of those will be reset by the end of next year. So people are going to face higher housing costs. And that'll be driven. So this is why the Bank of Canada cannot keep rates this high, because the impact next year will be far too significant for the consumer to handle. So where are we seeing the signs of stress? It's not in mortgages yet. People's home is kind of the last thing they typically default on, but we are starting to see pressure in things like lines of credit and installment loans. So those payments have gone up dramatically for things like car loans, term deposit loans, things like that, and people are starting to default on them at rates that are much higher than pre-pandemic levels. And lastly, for me, we call this slide locked out. I think it's important just to keep in mind that housing affordability is now at its worst level since 1985. So almost 40 years of data. This shows you the minimum you need to cover sort of your average mortgage in the US with a 20% down payment. So your constituents are facing higher cost of housing, kind of a double-edged or double whammy of people moving to Alberta, which Chart will go over, and then also the higher interest rates. Sorry, I can hear somebody.
Are we able to just mute the other callers on the line other than CIBC? Thank you.
Okay, Chart.
Sorry about that, James.
So just like from a James's perspective, we got inflation is on the right track. So the Bank of Canada, the US Fed, they're all trying to get us to 2%. So we're on the right track. We're not there yet, but this is positive because the rising rate environment that we've seen over the better part of 2 years should be in theory behind us. So there's a couple other things that we can take a look at outside of just how inflation's doing to assess from a timing perspective why we can start building the case that on this side of the border, on the north side of the border, we're going to start cutting rates faster and more dramatically than the US counterparties will. The first area we look at is growth. This just kind of shows you the sentiment from the Bank of Canada in terms of their growth forecast. So the dotted blue line there would be the pre-COVID trend of where growth was trending to. So that would have been the straight line growth forecast for GDP pre-COVID. Then COVID hit, and that would be those two lines that you kind of see there. The light gray line was the January 2022 monetary policy report. The interesting factor for that one is basically the bank came out and said, here's how we're going to get back on track. So yes, we've seen some pain, but here's how we're going to get everybody back on track. They were still using words like transitory inflation, supply chain bottlenecks will dissipate, all of this. They weren't factoring in things like large amounts of immigration, net migration affecting the levels of demand in Canada. And then fast forward to April 2023, we see a stark change in the sentiment from the monetary policy report, where they're basically going, okay, we're not getting on track anymore. We're not going to go back to pre-COVID trends. We're actually going to aim for a lower level of demand going forward. Why that's important to the positive of where we see that interest rate cycle is because when you look at GDP as the numbers by themselves and the better part of isolation over the last year, the GDP numbers and the growth numbers we've seen are pretty strong. Like it looked like we had a fairly resilient economy, specifically in the US. And the problem with looking at GDP by itself is it doesn't tell us the full story. So if we separate Canada and the US, the next thing we look at, okay, we're going to aim for a lower level of growth, but how are we doing from a growth perspective? It's coming down. Where do we kind of see it? Where is that trending? GDP, if we take the GDP numbers in Canada and look at them per capita, so per the average household, how much output we're getting, we can see that that trend is coming down. The growth forecast is coming down, mirroring what the monetary policy report is looking at. We don't see the per capita numbers in the US coming down yet. That is kind of the first flash sign, warning sign for us that, hey, the growth numbers are coming down in Canada because of the reasons James just said. We're significantly more sensitive to debt than our counterparties in the south side of the border. We can't buy those 30-year fixed rate mortgages. But the first flashing sign is the data has now get disconnected from a GDP perspective. We're shrinking. So from a timing perspective, all this graph is showing you right now is we're going to cut sooner than the US. We are not going to wait for them, which historically we've essentially had to. The other thing from a growth forecast is, yes, okay, it's coming down, that we see, and the big debate from an economist, and if you put on any news cycle right now, is it's two things. It's one, when does inflation get on track so we can start cutting those rates? Need a lot of data on these slides, but the two items to anchor to is all items CPI inflation. That's our inflation numbers in Canada and US. The big difference is we're getting to 2% on the forecast mid next year, the US end of next year. So from a timing perspective, we expect rate cuts to come in on our side of the border middle of next year. And as James just said, for the US on the end of the next year. The other one is the top line there, the real GDP growth. I put this up in this slide specifically quarter by quarter for one reason. The US, the news cycles right now are going, they keep talking about this big dreaded R word. Are we going to have a recession, or are we going to have what's called a soft landing? What a recession technically means is you need two negative quarters back to back. So that top line, you need to have two negative quarters back to back. And I put this up because Q3 forecast 0.1, Q3 forecast, Q2 forecast of this year 0.1, Q3 forecast of this year negative 0.7. We are about as close basically on a razor's edge to having to call a technical recession without it actually being one. So from a recession standpoint or a soft landing standpoint, we're indifferent. Like whether we get a recession or not, we're about as close as you can possibly be without having to technically call it that. But the reality is the pain is already in the economy. Why pain is a good thing moving forward is the quicker we feel pain, the quicker we get to 2% inflation, the quicker we can get to interest rate cutting cycles and back to a normalization of the debt cycles. The other story that we've kind of seen come out in the news that is interesting to track and kind of funny to track is what's called a soft landing. A soft landing is when essentially central bankers can raise interest rates enough to slow the economy down to get inflation to 2% without triggering a recession. So basically what you're looking at right now from a razor's edge perspective. The problem with paying attention to the news is they're not actually the best predictors or forecasters when it comes to a soft landing. So the slide that we're looking at here is we actually can track it all the way back to 1995 and looking at all the news articles that mention a soft landing. And we can kind of see that every time that the news media out there has tried to predict a soft landing, the large gray shaded columns that you're looking at is when we actually get a recession. So every recession has been preceded by news cycles predicting a soft landing. So from a news cycle perspective, they're not the best forecasters out there. So that's not one we essentially pay attention to. The other easy one to look at is what are banks doing? When banks get strict, it usually means a recession. Same thought process as the previous chart there. The long gray shaded columns are every time there's a recession. And then the actual line bars there are bank lending policies. So you can see that every time we get a strictness in policies from the average, generally means a recession is coming. Myself and James, we're indifferent whether it's a recession or a soft landing. The reality is we just want that pain to come so we can get past this and get into that interest rate cutting cycle and get in so we can have a more normalization of rate cycles moving forward. So that's kind of Canada as a whole. Our growth forecast is to come down, but how are we going to fare province by province? Specifically, how are we going to fare here in Alberta? Well, 2023, the forecast for for Alberta growth at 2.3%, beating the national average of 1.2%. And then again, 2024, the national average of 0.7%, and us beating the national average by at 1.5%. Inflation, 2023 forecast for inflation in Canada is about 3.9%. Alberta at 3.5%, so faring just a little bit better. 2024, 2.6% versus the national average of 2.3. Those would be largely driven by commodities, which I'll get into in a couple slides here. So overall, Canada's faring better from a growth perspective, driven by commodities, and other sectors like residential real estate, where we have that large amount of net migration coming to Alberta, and I'll get into that detail as well. But that's helping our growth, but it's not necessarily helping the best from an inflation standpoint. Makes it a little bit stickier, but the reality is all of these are still, as you can see, trending towards that 2% target that the bank wants to see. So yes, we're coming down. We'll probably start coming down mid next year. The other question that comes up quite a bit is, okay, when we start coming down, how far are we going to come down to? The first short answer is 0.25%, sub 2% debt levels. Those days are gone. Free debt is basically done. This graph kind of, it's not as complex as it might seem here. There's two things that we can look at to history to look at what's going to happen when we cut rates going forward. This graph looks at that red bar. The red bar is what's called a neutral rate. It's a theoretical rate. It's what rate would the Bank of Canada would have to set interest rates at to neither make the economy stimulative nor detracting to curb inflation. So what rate would they could just keep it neutral without creating growth or detracting from growth? And then the gray line is where they actually kept rates. The key trend to look at here is they've always been below the neutral rate. So they've always actually been trying to stimulate inflation, because from 2005 to the better part of until about last year, inflation in Canada has actually been very hard to get. It's been near zero or sub to 2% for a really, really long time. Then now moving forward, what has kind of shifted is this deglobalization, buy domestic, America first, supply chain bottleneck changes that have had a structural impact. It's now shifted to the point where we're going to have to keep rates in more of a not in less of a stimulative policy perspective. So what this graph is essentially showing us is structurally we've changed, where historically we haven't been able to get inflation to where we want, to now we're probably going to have to continue to try and curb inflation. So that tells us that rates are going to be slightly elevated in the new norm from what our generation is probably used to. Now, how much lower? Lower rates needed by 2025 to avoid a big refinancing hit. So on the left-hand side, there is a Canadian 5-year bond, Government of Canada bond yield. We look at that because that's the benchmark for mortgages, for Canadian mortgages. On the right-hand side there, on those gray bars, if rates stay where they currently are at, and the Bank of Canada does not step in and cut rates, you can see what this shows you the percent change in your monthly payment at renewal. So if the Bank of Canada doesn't step in, 2024, 15% monthly increase, 2025, 20% increase, 2026, 25% increase to your monthly payment. The Bank of Canada sees these numbers. This is why they were so aggressive with their rate hiking cycle, because they needed to get inflation down fast, because at renewal perspective, the monthly payment increase would have been very material. However, even with rates being cut, where rates are going to be cut to, where the forecast is, which is those three dotted plots on the left side there, there's still going to be a material increase. We're still looking at probably an average increase of about 10% to the consumer's monthly mortgage payments. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I believe this is a pretty good thing. My generation specifically has been very used to cheap levels of debt. A 4 to 5% debt level historically is still a structurally good place to be. It's just my generation has been so used to one side of that coin, so it forces you to be a little bit more conservative from your debt service perspective. So this will get us essentially to a normal interest rate cycle is what essentially we're going to see. So we're going to come down. The rate forecast is for it to come down. It's still going to take a bite because, as James mentioned, 60% of Canadian mortgages are subject to higher rates next year. So we need to get inflation down fast. Now, when they do start coming, how fast do they come down to and where do they come down to? The top line that you're looking at there, the overnight target rate, is that the Bank of Canada is currently at 5%. Me and James are long done predicting when they're going to stop hiking rates. I can tell you that every economic tool and formula we've ever been taught that we can utilize to plunk into the economic forecast tells us that we do not need to raise rates any more than they already are at to get inflation down to 2%. And lo and behold, in the last month, we've seen the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and the US Feds come out and say, high rates are working. We're still waiting for inflation to come down. So it seems like they're agreeing with the economic forecast here. So they're currently at 5%. They're going to start cutting mid next year. And when they do start cutting, finishing the year at 3.5%, and then continuing that cutting cycle to the following year at 2.5%, all the way down to 2.5%. So going 5 to 3.5 by next year, and then another full percentage point after that. That is a very important piece. The other one for you guys specifically is that 10-year government bond number. We can see that those interest rate coming down from 4% all the way to sub 3%. This is that reinvestment risk that James was highlighting for you. We are positioned very well to take advantage of this. This shows us that our expected return is going to materially increase as we reinvest into the rising rate environment. So that's where we can kind of see that forecast line up with what James has mentioned. So overall, the rate cuts are coming in Canada faster than the US. On the bottom of the slide there, you can see that the US, if you guys are interested, less important for us here on this side of the border, but they're probably going to start cutting end of next year and finish the year slightly higher than where they're anticipated in this forecast based on today's inflation, and then continuing that cutting cycle because they just can't get their inflation curbed like we can. So rates coming down. Now let's pivot a little bit to commodities, specifically in here in Alberta, because commodities, yes, they're great for the economy, but they also, double-edged sword, are not the best from an inflation standpoint. Alberta oil, crude oil, the forecast right now gives you guys a sense of volatility. When I put this forecast together for you guys, crude oil sitting just around $80, today around $68. There's two things that are happening in the commodity complex that are creating significant amount of volatility to both the upside and the downside. To the upside, two wars, two large geopolitical risk sentiments that if they basically spread out at all can continue to rise all commodity prices. On the flip side, from a detractor standpoint, well, we just touched on it. We're raising rates to curb growth, and commodities are an input to a lot of economic growth out there. So that's kind of limiting the amount of upside we can get. So how we look at that from a forecast, we just extrapolate that range of that $70 to $90, and that's kind of that wide range we kind of sit in that forecast going forward. Not necessarily a bad thing if you're an oil and gas company or any company out there. It's a lot easier to do capital expenditure programs when you have a reasonable expectation of what prices are going to be. When it's boom and bust, you don't like to put capital to work. So this is good for the province as a whole. Population and labor force. This is specifically in Alberta, a weird micro trend that Alberta is essentially kind of seen versus all of our peers. Population and labor force growth helping find a stronger footing, specifically here in Alberta. 66,000 individuals net migration to Alberta in the last data record I saw. That is really good for Alberta, where you have a lot of people for BC and Ontario essentially going, we can continue to work remote forever and work hybrid. We're going to move to where it's significantly more affordable to move, unlock large portions of our equities. So Alberta residential real estate market has been doing really good. The rental market has also been doing good. This is really good if you own a home, but as James mentioned, new entrants to the market from an affordability standpoint, it creates kind of a complex issue that I do not want to be the one to have to solve. I do not envy that person. So as a national average, this is what we've kind of seen. We touched on net migration, but immigration trends have continued strongly. That's not going anywhere. And housing starts to come down. So from a demand perspective, we have a lot more entrants in the market that need homes. And from a housing starts perspective, from a supply perspective, that number's kind of gone down. So we hit this inflection point in 2022. And how do we kind of get that back together? That's what the policy is going to be going forward. How do we get these numbers back to track? It's not as easy as it seems as just kind of building a bunch of new homes, because as we know, there's a big lag between when you start construction and when you finish that home. The other thing is just more data on what I was chatting about there. The forecasted population growth pre-COVID is that darted gray line on the left, and the red bar is where we actually are at. So well above trend, and it's not going to come back to trend anytime soon. And then the housing completions, to give you guys a sense of how far we're lagging in terms of supply. Yes, we want to build a lot of new supply. Well, the red line at the top there is the pace needed to catch up with the current population growth. There's a very wide gap between where the current forecast is, taking into account the new supply that's about to come online with the incentives that the feds just pushed out. there's still a wide gap, and there's still going to be a delay to close that gap because you can't just plop a bunch of houses in. There's a delay in construction. That's the concern. Essentially, the feds right now are trying to go, how can we close this gap? Yes, there's incentives, but again, double-edged sword here. It's not as easy as it seems. There's two things trend within the real estate sector and construction sector. One is there's just not enough labor capacity right now. We don't have the construction workers here in Canada to complete it. The number of construction workers completed per unit under construction has been a steady trend kind of coming down, so we don't have the labor needed. And then on the right-hand side there, the amount of time it takes to build a home, going all the way back, the completion lag has gotten longer and longer and longer and longer. So it's going to take a lot longer than everybody anticipates to get that inflection point back down. They are doing the right things. They're incentivizing with more supply. But like I said, it takes time for that supply to come online. Then we see the other delay, which is construction completion lags have come out in terms of longer as well. So really good for Alberta, but not necessarily if you're a new entrant to the market. But if you already have a home, our residential real estate market starts to, we're always kind of like an inverse economy from our peers out there. So we'll fare pretty good from that perspective. So kind of summing it up, we're hanging in, but for how long? Alberta economy has a better chance of defying the gravitational pull of higher interest rates than all of our other peers in the country. We're structurally set up very well from a affordability standpoint. We're seeing that net migration there coming to Alberta for a reason. Inflation in Canada has eased more than in other countries, which is going to allow us and open the platform for them to start cutting rates in Canada faster, and they're not going to have to wait for other central bankers out there. So we'll be one of the first ones to do it because of our sensitivity to higher debt. The characteristics of a post-pandemic world mean there's going to be a longer lag between rate hikes and a slowdown, but it's not going to prevent one. This is kind of that, whether it's recession or soft landing, we're indifferent. Short-term pain equals long-term gain. We just want to get quicker to that cycle. Rapid immigration and population growth is adding to inflation in housing, but it's also helping fill job vacancies and help ease inflation in other areas. It's kind of a double-edged sword when we kind of look at that one. It's both a detractor and a stimulant to the economy. The interest rate cuts are going to come in early 2024. How far and quickly rate cuts come is going to be different to prior cycles due to those lingering supply chain constraints. We've gotten rid of the supply chain constraints, but there's been a structural shift, as I mentioned, where we now need to stay in an elevated rate environment. So if I were to kind of distill this presentation into two pieces, it's lending rates right now are elevated. If we can defer that and defer projects, absolutely do that. And then from a investment revenue perspective, it's expected to materially increase. With that, I want to pass it back to you guys for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, James and Chart. Does anybody have any questions about the economic update? I'm not seeing any questions, but we do appreciate the comprehensiveness and the insights that you've provided. Thank you.
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you.
Perhaps a motion to accept the presentation as information.
I will so move.
Any questions or discussion? Call a roll call vote. Councillor Laverson? Councillor Kester? Deputy Reeve Clausen?
In favor.
Reeve Link is in favor. Councillor Eichert?
In favor.
Councillor Baker?
In favor?
Councillor Laprise?
In favor.
Motion is carried. We'll move to agenda item 2.2. Good morning.
Good morning again. Taylor Feltz with administration, excuse me, presenting an update on affordable housing needs in the county and to seek clarity on an April 4th, 2023 resolution directing administration to review the Government of Alberta's online affordable housing needs assessment guidebook and tool, and to bring a report back to council at a future date. This request came following a discussion concerning accommodation and affordability at the Wheatland Lodge in Strathmore. In staff's review of the online assessment tool, a copy of which is attached to page 38 here in the agenda package, it was determined that the county does not historically monitor or track the data required to complete the assessment for any fruitful insights on that information. The assessment was created as a tool to support a standardized approach in evaluating housing needs across the province as a result of Bill 78, the Alberta Housing Amendment Act. And the Act aims to address the growing demand for affordable housing and improve access for those in need. The assessment is to be municipally led in collaboration with other stakeholders such as housing management bodies, local housing operators, and nonprofit organizations. It requires the identification of the county's top 3 priority housing types, the number of units needed, and rationale to support these priorities. It also recommends that engagement with community members and stakeholders be included, which the county has not undertaken at this time on that topic. So administration is revisiting the discussion today with the committee to confirm the desired outcomes and seek better understanding of the committee's interest in pursuing an affordable housing needs assessment and or a needs assessment with a focus on affordable seniors housing in the county. Currently, the data and expertise required to undertake the assessment, an assessment like this, is not available in-house. And so that brings us to the essential question for the committee today, which is whether or not the county wishes to engage a consultant to assist in the completion of an assessment like that. And I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your feedback.
Thank you so much. Discussion.
So I have the same thoughts. Are we interested in affordable housing, or are we interested in understanding seniors' affordable housing? For me, to do something like this, I would be curious what we would do with the results. So if we were just to look at Wheatland County and determine that there were affordable housing needs in our county, what would we do with that? How can a municipality influence, I guess, the results of a study such as this? I'm just curious what our response to it would be if we were to do it.
Through the chair, that information could be used when updating our policies, such as a regional growth management study or area structure plans that are coming online. It would help us identify that as a priority when we're looking for future development throughout the county.
For myself, I think just given the fact that we have finite resources and just some of the other areas that we're focusing on right now, and also given the fact that there is an application through the housing management body into the Alberta Housing HPP
Partnership program.
Thank you. To me, this is something that isn't necessarily a priority that I'm hearing from ratepayers currently, but perhaps something that could be revisited, particularly as we see shifts in primary sectors and that type of thing, which my gut sense is, given sort of the sectors that are coming in and the labor requirements and that type of thing, that there should be, I'm not sure that it will necessarily significantly impact the requirements for affordable housing, just given like projected wages and things like that in the sectors that are projected to grow in Wheatland County and the region. This information is really helpful just to have around what the framework looks like, what the template looks like. I did note like a lot of the information is available through census data. We also do have a resolution into GOA regarding using more publicly available data to make more data-driven, evidence-based decisions. So I wouldn't mind seeing just how that, what the response is from the government of Alberta in terms of that resolution. But for me, this is good information, but not something I would necessarily prioritize at this time, given the finite resources and the substantial other projects that we're looking at right now. Any other questions or discussion?
They said that it would be something that we would contract out. Is there a kind of predicted price how much this would cost?
Through the chair, I couldn't even ballpark at this point. It would really depend on perhaps the criteria that we'd be looking for in that output, how long that might take.
I was also going to just point out that there is the Wheatland Housing Management Body had it's a 2019, so it's a few years out of date probably, but it gives a pretty good indication of seniors housing needs in the area, in the region. And so, yeah, I agree with you that I'm not sure it's the priority that we have right now. We do have other infrastructure projects that we're going to undertake. And so, yeah, I don't feel like we should go forward with this any further at this point.
So we don't give direction necessarily, but does anybody object to perhaps taking this sort of off of the table for now, deferring it to potentially reconsider in the future? Is there anybody that would object to that? Just that administration has some guidance on what direction we might be going in. Does that give administration a good sense? Yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you for bringing the information. We do appreciate it. Let's move to agenda item. Oh, let me just check. So I don't know that we need a motion. I think it was more just for information for the committee. Wonderful. Let's move to agenda item 2.3.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Chris
morning.
Kerman from administration here. I come this morning with a proposition for discussion right now to review the Wheatland County's current noise bylaw. I know we did just revisit and pass a new noise bylaw back in 2022. However, we've had some events occur over the last couple of years that have been difficult to control isn't the right word, but to negotiate and mitigate based on what we currently have in place in our bylaw. So based upon these events that have happened, we took it upon ourselves to go through and review and update a little bit further the noise bylaw so it can become more enforceable and gives a little bit more ability to control things as they happen rather than the way it's written now, where it appears like an event has to happen and then action can be taken afterwards. And my goal and the goal of administration in this bylaw is to have the ability to put a stop to something, or at least have the ability to direct it to be stopped and then be able to issue fines directly and immediately if it doesn't, and based on a continuation of an offense, you could issue 3 or 4 fines in one day or one sitting kind of thing. There are a couple main points that have been added, that I've added, of course, for discussion. We do have some definitions that have been changed to add some agricultural operation, ambient sound, amplified sound, continuous sound. Just to clarify what they are, Section 4 in noise control, the way the bylaw is written right now, it puts the onus upon a peace officer to determine whether a noise is a nuisance, and consultation with Crown Prosecutor and legal, basically that's really not ours to determine. That really can be determined by a judge in a court of law in a hearing. That's who makes the decision whether a disturbance is, or a noise can be considered disturbing or not. One thing I've added is to direct that the noise be abated immediately, which we didn't have before. And then I also wanted to put in, one of the things what we struggle with when it comes to noise complaints is that unfortunately citizens don't understand why we can't be the primary complainants, is because we as police officers can't be disturbed by something when we're not directly affected by it. So I can drive up to a noisy party and I can go, yeah, this is terrible, but I can drive away and it doesn't affect me anymore. which is why for a successful prosecution, we require statements from people who are directly affected by it. And so I've just added this in here so that is part of the bylaw, so that it just affirms that in order for us to move forward and prosecute, not saying we can't without prosecution, but in order for us to prosecute it, we would have to have evidence from an affected person, and all a peace officer can do is corroborate that evidence to a court. Went into exemptions and exceptions, just clarified that a little bit further. Clarifies the things that don't constitute noise. And section 6 for the permit, so for clarity, I just added noise exemption permit rather than just a permit. And then section 15 I added as well to codify that the county and its officers do have discretion when it comes to enforcing a bylaw, whether they do warnings, whether they issue violation tickets, or choose to take no action in that part. So anyways, that's kind of the meat of it. And I just wanted to bring forward for council's direction, opinion, see if this is something that is of interest at this point. Just as we know, there may or may not be certain events that come up that we get a little bit handcuffed with, and we'd like to be able to have the ability to deal with them in a more timely fashion and give us, as our enforcement department and the RCMP as well, when they're dealing with these things, the ability to deal with these things a little bit faster. And I'm open for any questions.
Any questions? Councillor Larson and then Councillor Laprise.
Can you just expand on what agriculture noise, because I must not be able to read properly today.
Sure. Yeah, it's very broad. Agricultural activity conducted on agricultural land for gain or reward in the hope or expectation of gain or reward includes cultivation, the raising of poultry, fur-bearing animals, pheasants, fish, or livestock, including domestic cervids, within but not limited to the meaning of livestock in the livestock industry, production of agricultural field crops, fruit, vegetables, sod, trees, shrubs, and other specialty horticultural crops, eggs, milk, honey, the operation of agricultural machinery and equipment, including irrigation pumps, the application of fertilizers, insecticides, pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides, including application by ground and aerial spraying, collection, transportation, storage, application, use, transfer, and disposal of manure, composting materials, compost, and abandonment and reclamation of confined feeding operations and manure storing facilities. Basically, we don't want to stop farming operations.
So all of those are exempt?
Yep.
Okay.
That's anything to do with an agricultural operation would not fall under this noise bylaw. I've gotten complaints in the past that the cows are too loud. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, you live in a agricultural in a rural area, that's going to happen, and that's not in our purview to stop, and there's no intention of it.
Well, the federal government's going to fix that because they're going to stop cows from burping.
Right.
But if you told somebody to shut their combine down,
it wouldn't happen.
2 in the morning, wouldn't be a happy day for you.
And it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
That's
Thank you.
We, as an agricultural community, that's our prime goal, is to ensure that our agricultural operators can get their crops in and get their crops out in a timely fashion. We're definitely not here to stop that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councillor Laprise and then Councillor Bigger.
So just in the body of the report, talks about how complaints often happen late at night when you're not on duty. How could we improve that? Is there any way of, how do you address that? I'm not sure.
Well, resource-wise, we don't have the resources in our department to provide 24-hour day coverage. We're 12 to 15 hours at best at any given time. However, we do have RCMP detachments in our county who also, and if you read the definition of what an enforcement officer is, they qualify under that. They could respond in a first response kind of thing to a complaint like that, and then would be passed on to us to follow up later on.
So they can enforce our bylaws?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you.
So if the fines aren't paid, just step me through that. Is that when you would, we could take them to court? Is that how that?
No, it would be, an example would be, you're having a house party, the music's thumping, bass is loud. I drive up, I can hear it from a block away. I have a complainant who's willing to provide a written complaint. We walk up, knock on the doors. We've got a complaint about the noise, need to turn it down. You say, okay, you turn it down, 5 minutes later, it goes back up. We can start issuing fines based on that as long as the affected person is willing to go to court and back up the complaint. And we could continue to issue fines because they basically have a continuing nature until it stops. Now, we would have to prove in court why we issued 5 fines in 2 hours on a place, but that may turn it into something more criminal rather than under a bylaw matter at that point. You could look at more of that as a mischief, criminal mischief, rather than just a noise bylaw complaint, but that would be something that the police would have to decide if they were responding to it or not. But we can issue fines. We could issue fines on the first instance if we have somebody who is willing to attend court and testify to it.
But just to clarify, do you go to court automatically? You go to court regardless?
It's no different than a speeding ticket. You would be issued a violation ticket. The fines are such where they're on what's called a Part 3 ticket, so it's no different than like a speeding ticket or a stop sign ticket. You are issued a court date. If you haven't paid or made a plea by that date, the fine goes against your driver's license and motor vehicle stuff. So
I guess that was my next question then. What can a landowner with tickets, can that go to their taxes?
No. Okay. And let me phrase that. Actually, no, there isn't a way to do it. No, we have to go through the court process with it. We have the ability to issue municipal tags, and if they come to the office and pay them directly here, then we recoup 100% of the fines. But if we go through the court procedure, actually on a bylaw matter, we recoup 100% of the fines too. But if we go through the court process, generally we don't do the tags. We do the violation tickets, because if you issue a tag and they don't pay it, then we have to chase the person down again to issue them the other ticket.
Any other questions or discussion? I have a question, 2 questions for under section 4.2. So in the new bylaw, it would be on page 73. There's a reference to, in B, the location of the disturbance and whether or not the disturbance occurred in a residential development or residential building. Is there a way to reference sort of the rural context specifically within those considerations? Because I know, and I can send this to all of council, I had sent it to CAO Henderson previously, but there was some consideration in a noise. It was to do with an Alberta energy regulator project, I believe, in Sturgeon County, and they delineated out like base level noises in urban versus rural, and that rural, like basically the ambient noise, which you reference in the bylaw, is lower in an urban setting. And where it, I think, becomes relevant is like a decibel reading in a city that might not be a nuisance necessarily in a city, or, you know, people might be able to live with. In a rural setting where our ambient noise is very low, and where we have livestock and where we have other considerations, and also just like development considerations, like where it's wide open prairie versus a lot of development that may or may not help abate like how far the noise travels or how much it impacts adjacent landowners. And so they actually like set for impacts a lower sort of base noise level than you would in an urban setting. I'll send it to council. But just if we could specify that rural is unique, and I'm just thinking in terms of if it did come to court and reviewing the context of a complaint and the impact on people. So just something that I wouldn't mind contemplating. And then probably this question would be both to enforcement, but also to development and planning. Under 5.1, so on page 74, clause D, construction during the daytime, whether or not such construction requires a permit. And then if we go to the definition of daytime, it's 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. We frequently, or not frequently, but we do have development permits where construction is constrained to hours, like that would not align with the definition of daytime. And so I'm just wondering, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable having construction excluded, like as an exemption. I would rather the DP be the defining time limits for construction noise.
And through the chair, we could adjust the timeline as well. Just a lot of, when I was reading through, several more municipalities and such were extending the daytime because events do tend to happen, especially in the summertime, a little bit further out. The old bylaw had 9 o'clock. So, I mean, I'm open to changing it to that.
I don't mind the definition of daytime for typical noise. Like I'm thinking one-offs or, you know, those types of things. I think people are more accommodating of that, but construction can be persistent and incessant. And if it's daily and if it was going, you know, under those daytime, I'm just wondering if there's a way to rather have the DP be the defining factor for construction noise.
Through the chair to the committee, it would work for a lot of DPs, but not for all construction noises. Like if it's a business, we restrict the hours of operation based on noise. But for example, on housing construction where we got noise where they were constructing after 11 p.m., we would not have that in a DP because it's tied to a building permit and we don't restrict construction that way. So we could narrow this and look at wording to include whichever's the more restrictive. If it's the development permit, and then work with the daytime hours. It's just during the summer they were trying to utilize the daylight hours other than the floodlights at 2 a.m.
I'm just wondering if you could say with that, if it's otherwise listed in the DP, so like put it right into there, unless stated otherwise in the development permit.
Yeah, I think that would work well. E does say any activity identified and approved by way of DP. I just didn't want that construction clause to override anything. And I do see the merit in increasing the daytime hours, and even if administration just looks at it and brings a recommendation back, when it sounds like there may be an appetite to bring this. I would strongly support this coming back for amendment. I don't know if we haven't really addressed that piece of it, but.
I think it's so inherent on location of where the construction is going, right? If they're doing construction in long hours, let's say at Origin Business Park, yeah, that's not going to affect anybody. But it is going to, if it's in a hamlet, it's definitely going to affect somebody. So yeah, I think there's got to be a little bit more thinking about how we address this. Because if you have neighbors, that causes problems. Whereupon if you're in the middle of a quarter, nobody really cares, right? So.
Does anybody object to this coming back for amendment? My final question is on page 73, and it's legalese, and I'm sure it came from a lawyer. And I just want to make sure we're not limiting ourselves. When it says right at the beginning of that, whether a particular sound constitutes a noise or constitutes an excessive, unnecessary, or unusual noise, or questions of fact to be determined by a court hearing. Like, I understand why we need to have that in there, but could somebody then argue that, for example, like you couldn't issue a violation tag based on a written complaint because that's saying like that is a question of fact to be determined by a court?
No, so Madam Chair, that actually is to say that only a court can determine whether it's a nuisance noise or not. So we still have the authority to stop it.
Okay.
But in order to determine whether it's an actual offense is determined by a judge. Okay. The way the old bylaw is written, it's by a peace officer, and we don't really have that authority to make that determination. Only a court of law and a justice in a court of law would.
Okay, that makes sense. And I saw 8.1 that you are authorized and empowered to issue a municipal tag to any person who the peace officer has reasonable and probable grounds to believe has contravened any provision of the bylaw. So as long as that's not a limiting factor, and it does make sense that that would be the ultimate deciding factor if somebody wanted to contest the tag. Okay.
Yeah, through the chair, they would have that. That's their opportunity, is to come in court and, as the Crown, we would provide evidence as to why we believe that it was a nuisance noise, and then the defense would have the opportunity to say why it wasn't, and then of course then the justice would make that decision whether they determined it was a nuisance noise or not.
Perfect. Yeah, no, and we obviously want that procedural fairness and everything explicitly spelled out in the bylaw, so I appreciate that. Any other questions or discussion? Do you have any other questions for us?
I don't, Madam Chair, I believe I've got what I need from you, and I will work on this and bring it forward in the near future.
Wonderful. Thank you for your work on it. We appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
Let's move to agenda item 2.4.
Morning, committee members. Stefan Kuntz presenting on behalf of administration. So this item is in response to a request for more information regarding the difference between discretionary and permitted development permits. The question was regarding whether or not some time could be saved by having some discretionary uses as permitted. So generally, because of the complexity of discretionary uses that go into it, really it's not so much a legislative aspect that makes them take longer, it's more kind of the complexity of it. So there isn't really much benefit in order to doing that. But I'll kind of go into the differences between them both and kind of explain why there. So for permitted uses in the MGA, these are things that the Development Authority must approve, provided that it meets the requirements of the land use bylaw. So that carries with it kind of the implication that these are lower items that have lower potential to cause concern or impact to neighbors. Sorry, where's my slide here? Yeah, so it kind of reduces the Development Authority's ability to be proactive or reactive to kind of how neighbors are responding to mitigate those potential concerns. So we saw this morning with the item with the wedding venue and the dust and those type of things that are raised by the neighbors. Having it as a discretionary permit allows the Development Authority the ability to react to those things and add different conditions. So when we're looking at conditions for permitted uses, though, those can only be applied if they're expressly authorized by the land use bylaw. Now, our land use bylaw gives some discretion to other plans, such as the municipal development plan or area structure plans. However, that's kind of up in the air as to whether or not that would actually be able to be challenged. Additionally, with the right to appeal, it's rather limited in terms of permitted uses. So this could be either the landowner themselves, most likely would be the ones that would be doing it in terms of a permitted use, because there really is no venue for affected parties such as neighbors to appeal based on that. The only appeals that can be submitted for a permitted use or if the land use bylaw has been relaxed, varied, or misinterpreted. So then looking at discretionary use permits, so again, these are the ones that are more complex, and really having it listed as discretionary gives us that ability to tailor it more appropriately to the exact site. MPC can also decide whether or not to refuse it outright, provided everything has illegitimate planning and development rationale. So these permits may be issued, and often just based on the size and scale and scope. Again, these are things that are likely to have some kind of impact, whether it's increased traffic, dust, noise. Many of the conditions that we would then include are aimed at mitigating those items. So the conditions that we can add there, again, they can be within the land use bylaw, but there is a much broader availability to apply those. They don't necessarily even have to be in there. As long as they are meeting, again, a rational planning and development purpose, then those can be included. In terms of the right to appeal, also, these can be pretty much anything, including the decision, can be appealed by the applicant, and then again, any affected parties. So if somebody was next door, they felt that the conditions weren't satisfying their concerns, they could then appeal that to the relevant board. Pardon me. So in summary, generally, in terms of just like the time that these are processed. There's about another 2 to 3 weeks that go into just from the legislative requirement. Additionally, with the development discretionary permits. And this is obviously because once the development officer determines a permitted one is ready to go, they can approve it that same day. If it goes to MPC, they have to prepare the report, schedule it, those type of things. But really that period of time isn't really material when it comes to looking at these permits, because quite often, again, we're going to have technical studies, stakeholder collaboration, much more detailed site assessments, and then often, again, determining those specific conditions that need to be applied in order to mitigate the concerns that have been raised. So that's kind of where the bulk of the time goes with those. And again, whether or not they're discretionary or permitted, all that time is going to happen regardless. But by having it listed as a discretionary use, it gives us the ability, and the board the ability, or the committee, sorry, the ability to actually react to those concerns and have conditions applied accordingly. In terms of how those conditions, or what is discretionary or permitted, the different types of uses, those are things that have kind of either done through engagement. So the land use bylaw has a number of these things that are listed now. So a landowner can look at their neighboring property and say, I'm aware that these are the type of uses, the residents on a residential parcel. Those are simple, that's going to happen, right? But if they are a little bit more broad, then at least they know they have the capacity to say, I have concerns about X, Y, and Z. Can we mitigate those if we're going to go with one of these more discretionary ones? And then also, obviously, the committee members and councillors will get feedback, and I know staff does as well, regarding particular type of uses that we see quite often, abattoirs, the scrap yards, those type of things. Those cause a lot of issues. So we are constantly monitoring those and determining kind of which is more appropriate in which area. So that largely concludes things for me. And again, there's really no substantive benefit in terms of like time-wise to making things from discretionary to permitted. Again, most of that time is built into the complexity of the assessment. So that concludes, and I'll happy to take any questions.
Any questions regarding the report? No questions? Was really comprehensive, and I think does an excellent job of just delineating discretionary versus permitted. The only thing I might just slightly respectfully push back on is we may come across things that are designated as discretionary where upon further reflection there isn't, or there's not significant impact to adjacent landowners. Every once in a while a ratepayer brings something to my attention and they're like, this is not going to have any impact, but then usually you can point out an instance of worst case scenario where it could. So I think we do want to be very cautious that we want to streamline and make things as efficient as possible, but not eliminate those opportunities to mitigate those impacts. So it's that always finding that balance. So I think this did a really good job of summarizing that. And I think if there are instances where a discretionary use is identified that, there really is nominal risk of impact to adjacent landowners, we can reconsider that. But overall, this explains it very, very well. So I appreciate the work. Any other questions or comments? Thank you to everybody who worked on that. We will move on to 2.5 public hearing readings process.
Hello again, Stefan Kuntz from administration. So speaking of streamlining, this item concerns that we've identified an opportunity to streamline the bylaw, or at least the planning bylaw process in terms of how we do the readings. So you may recall on October 17th, there was an application for an amendment to the Direct Control District 7 that received all 3 readings at one hearing. So this is something that we could consider in order to streamline our timelines when it comes to this. So the current process that we use now has been to have essentially a separate council meeting where the first reading of the bylaw is considered. Then the hearing is scheduled. We would then advertise and then bring the item back for a second hearing later on. Having the two things like that, I mean, it's not necessarily wrong, but it does introduce some complications. So for one, there's the duplication of staff resources. Really, I mean, it's the same report for the most part, but in terms of scheduling it, having everybody listen to the presentation a couple different times. That obviously adds a little bit of time there. There's the potential to introduce inconsistencies in the information that's presented. It allows for a lengthier application process, and I'll touch more on that in a second. But then also the potential for council to receive information outside of a hearing. And I feel like this has been handled pretty well throughout this, but it does introduce that potential that somebody could feel if something's refused, they could feel that they weren't given a fair hearing because councillors were given information outside of that hearing process. Again, I haven't seen it happen here, but in the past there have been items where people will say, oh, I'm opposed to this, not in a hearing, then vote against it in the hearing, and then obviously the applicant would have the right to say, well, I didn't receive a fair hearing here. So that just removes even that perception that that type of thing is possible. So under the proposed process for this, we would essentially see all 3 readings done at once. So again, that was done on October 17th, so you've seen that happen before. Really, there's no kind of new changes that really have to happen. The only thing that would be different would just be how the resolutions are worded. And this third one here, that essentially is the permission for third reading. So that needs to be done unanimously if this is going to go through. So regardless of whether or not you vote against something, I would encourage you to give permission to go to third reading. You could then go back to voting against for third reading if you want. But if that unanimous consent isn't given, then it would have to come back for another reading. Obviously, again, not the end of the world, but just adds that little bit extra time. So the Municipal Government Act allows for that, as well as our procedural bylaw. And just as an indication of kind of the time savings we'd be looking. So here's just kind of an example when an item comes for first reading in week 4 here. And this is actually pretty optimistic that it would be 2 weeks. Often it's a little bit more than that before the public hearing can be scheduled. But in this situation, the same time we would do the first reading, obviously you just work with the applicant, make sure that they're comfortable to proceed to a hearing. Administration has the information they need to provide that to council, and then that could all happen on that same day. So yeah, that concludes things for me. I think moving all 3 of these things to one meeting would reduce the impact on staff resources, ensure consistent information, presentation of information, reduce the risk of legal challenges, and decrease application times. That concludes my presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Councillor Baker.
I like the change. I think it's it would streamline things really well. But I would ask that if it doesn't pass at the unanimously, that it come back to the next following, so that you don't forget what the public hearing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Presented.
Through the chair, that's certainly a good idea. I think it would be similar. It'd also be the reverse of what we do now, where you do the first reading. This is kind of quickly done. There's not really talking. Yeah.
So I was just trying to get my head around when would we get the whole package of what is involved, and how much time between when we get that and when we would be voting on it? Like I like the way it is now, because you have some time to consider. And I understand the risk is that you get some outside information, but I do like to just kind of consider things a little, especially if they're maybe contentious or complicated, or I like to kind of think about things for a while, but.
Through the chair. So under this, it would be essentially whenever the agenda is done now, I think the week before. But we would also have the advertisement period, like it still is required to be advertised in accordance with the Municipal Government Act. So it is possible that we could maybe advise council of that as well, provide you with the circulation notice that goes out. That could work as well.
But a circulation notice doesn't really include all of the details of the proposal, right? It's just it
would have through the chair, the one that goes to like agencies, for example, like Alberta Transportation, that will have kind of the letter that has all the information, the maps that you see in the packages now, as well as any kind of supporting documents. Those are all usually included. So the things that would be missing, obviously, is like how it's presented in the report, and then the policy analysis and the recommendation.
I think at times administration has put a link in the letter to the website for more complex applications as well, where ratepayers can access, again, not the same level of detail that we get in our packages for decision, but there is like a higher level of detail than what goes out in the mailed circulation. at least that would give us that. I do like the idea of that being sent to council as well, or us being just notified that it's being done so that we can, as you said, start digging into the issue and start considering it and contemplating it. And if there's research you want to do, you know, into our own policies or that type of thing, then it gives more time for that.
Yeah. And through the chair, I think it also gives the opportunity, I mean, if you do decide that more time is needed, you could say, let's just give first reading at this point, consider it again, and then reschedule the public hearing or table it to a future date. That's still available to you.
Any other questions or discussion? Again, we appreciate this being brought forward, and it was very fulsome and gives a good understanding of it. So thank you. Let's move to agenda. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Add it.
Of course.
So I've asked that I get notified of any, as a counselor, that's happening in my area, of anything that would be coming up for a public hearing or land use. So if that would just be sent to all of council instead of just myself, I think that would fit into this well too.
Sounds like a great idea.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's move to agenda item 2.6. Good morning.
Good morning, committee members. Dave from administration. On page 89 of the agenda package is the recreation policy 14.4 for Carsland and Glacier Community Facilities Grant. At the July 4th, 2023 meeting, council was discussing the CURB grant and how funds are allocated to Whelan County community organizations versus the village community organizations. And council expressed concerns around those allotments and how that was considered, and asked for more information to be brought back about the CURB funding. And that was done at the August 22nd meeting, committee of the whole meeting, and discussions around opportunities to strengthen the recreation policies and to look at the Carsland and Glacier Community funding grant to provide revisions to make it more inclusive of the other hamlets. So the draft policies in the package with those outlines to include those other hamlets, which are larger within Whelan County and have community facilities. So you might notice that Speargrass is not in there just because they don't have a community facility, like a community hall or a facility that way. That was brought up when we were reviewing it in administration level, so I thought I should just raise that. That's the reason why it's not in there. So the hamlets are included in this policy are Carsland, Cheadle, Dallam, Gleason, Nemeka, Nightingale, Clooney, Layalta, and Rosebud, because they all have those community kind of facilities. So the policy has the red and green line to show the changes, and I'm available for any questions.
Any questions regarding the proposed changes?
So it says here that it is provides operational and capital. I was under the assumption it was just capital. Does the communities know that it's operational too?
Yes, they do. And they've applied for both. Mostly it's operational kind of things, but there's an odd capital thing that maybe is included. But
okay.
Especially things like insurance and utilities and things like that.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I think it's a great idea to include the other facilities, and yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I think, so if you think about Clooney Hall and the Gleason Hall, Clooney is larger. They've invested a lot of money into the Gleason one, which is great, except that if you were to choose one or the other, for some events, Clooney is the better one for larger numbers of people. So yeah, I just think that we should include them in and the others in the funding that we're providing. They all have important facilities that I think we need to support.
Any other questions or discussion?
And this doesn't exclude them from curb?
It just excludes them if they're applying for, to make sure they're not double dipping.
Double
right?
dip
So
for
it's
on one project.
make sure that the projects are different or they're not
It's not related to the association though.
correct. Like they could still apply for a capital funding
For something
project from
else.
CURB and then apply for the operational and
Right.
whatever
Thank
kind
you.
of thing as well.
Yeah, that's what I need to know. Thanks.
Any other questions? Just one question on page 92. We have Dallam listed as a hamlet. I think on our municipal profile, Dallam is not identified as a hamlet, but Chancellor is. We could get around it just by saying like hamlets and named communities or something. I think in our community profile, we call them communities/localities. Dallam's under that.
Okay, I can take a look at that wording. I think we still want to keep Dallam in because they have a hall, correct?
And that's,
Yeah, I think we want to keep
Totally.
it in for, but yeah, I can play with that or.
I think
change the
just even
wording
in the
to be
policy
inclusive.
title, it could be hamlets/named. Planning will know much better than I will.
We've been using residential communities to encompass things that aren't listed as a hamlet.
Okay. And then I don't know if there is benefit to looking at, I know we just added like Zimmerfield into Lyalta and designated that specifically as a hamlet. I realized there was specific reasons for that. I don't know if there's any rationale for adding Dallam as a hamlet, but if not, if that's completely going off in left field, we can just update the title of the policy. Other than that, I thought it looked great and fully support it. Being more inclusive, I think it's great. And yeah, the question about curb, I think, is important. And any other questions or discussion? Do you need any? Oh, Councillor Kester.
We have other halls in the county that are strictly all county, but they're not named in. There, we got that. Yeah.
I think this required a lease to be in place. Is that the delineating?
They're community facilities. I guess they still can apply by curb and all that. That's not limited. I think what I like about this part is we're adding more money into the communities, basically. So it's what
Section 5, page 93.
But there are, like I just forget the name of the hall on the 817 there up there by the Karen Hill, yeah. So that's completely not in here, but neither is the ones in the villages either that are probably 80% county too. So this is a step in the right direction. It's still not perfect though.
Any other questions or discussion on it? Does administration need any other direction from us?
How is the monies, like we get an amount? I always use, how is that calculated? Like how is, because I know Carson was given, this is your amount. How is that given? Like, what's the total monies to divvy out?
In 2023, the amount was 200,000. It was distributed amongst Gleason and Carsland.
Oh, it's just a budget item?
It's just a
dollar
budget.
amount?
It's just a
It's
budget.
not collected from other,
No, it was just a budget amount the council set aside.
okay?
And if we change the policy, council may want to consider that budget amount as well.
Yeah.
If we change the policy to be more inclusive of other facilities.
Thank you.
Any other feedback you would like from us?
No, I can bring a revised policy to a future council meeting.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let's move to 2.7, small modular reactors.
Hello again, committee. Stefan Kuntz on behalf of administration. All right, so this item arose in response to a question regarding small modular reactors, or SMRs, and the potential for these to be located within Wheatland County. So we've had a look into this. It's kind of new information for us as well. So we've provided some reading as well. Hopefully that's sufficient. There's quite a bit in there. And then summarize some of the information as well in this report. So generally, I'll kind of introduce it, and then mostly what we're looking at here is that the regulatory framework is kind of up in the air right now, so it's not really established as to what the role of municipalities is going to be. So hopefully that more information is available in the future, but remains to be seen. So SMRs are nuclear reactors. They split the atom, make energy. Currently in Canada, nuclear reactors are used kind of in those large scale power plants. So that's between 600 and 1400 megawatts. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, are 300 megawatts or less. So this means they're more economical, they could be more cost effective, and allows them to be used in more remote locations. So these are used currently in submarine capacities, so those large things that have to go for a long time without docking anywhere, like aircraft carriers or submarines and those type of things. So they are used there, but this would see them used in a similar capacity but on land. So some of the examples they gave were providing energy to a mine or something. It's in a remote location, it's difficult to get energy there. This would essentially allow them to have the reactor there, make their own energy to power the mine. In terms of background work that's gone into this, so there's a number of provinces that have been working with the federal government. Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta signed a memorandum of understanding. It was in 2019, Alberta joined in 2021, in order to look into this, the potential for this to happen. And then a number of these documents here I linked as well, kind of discussed essentially everything we're looking at here. They've identified a number of benefits and challenges, so I can kind of go through those. Most likely it would be the federal government, who has some degree of capacity. They have it now under the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. But again, the role exactly as to how federal, provincial, municipal is all kind of up in the air. So in terms of benefits, they cite energy security, obviously being able to just have our own in-country energy and not be so reliant on the international oil and gas market, be less susceptible to fluctuations. Climate environment identifies this as a reducing the use of carbon-based non-renewable energy sources, thereby reducing emissions. And economic development. So because this is, it's kind of a two-parter of one with this, it can facilitate business opportunities, like I mentioned, the remote mines and those type of things. But also because it's an emerging technology, it's early enough that Canada could emerge as a global leader. Sorry, let's try this. Pardon me. Might have to. Yeah, so essentially it would be kind of at the forefront, allowing it for more research and manufacturing opportunities. Obviously, a number of challenges go with this. Technological readiness, because it is so new, really, is there going to be enough skilled workers? How are those deployed, trained? Needs to be a capacity available for that. The nuclear waste item is definitely a concern. Right now, for the existing facilities, they have to store it on site. There is the deep geologic repository, such as a deep mine where they would store all of it down there, but that's not expected to be operational until 2040 or 2045. But because these are smaller and in different locations, it's not quite clear how that would work. Is it going to be concentrated in one area? Do they have to hold it in these different locations? Again, that's not quite clear. Engagement, this is obviously going to be something you, if this does happen, would likely hear from your residents. So because it's also something new, people are going to want information. Right now, really there isn't much information available. So the documents that have been produced indicate that this is something that they are committed to. So at least there's that. Safety and emergency management. I kind of mentioned here about the local first responders, but since then I've spoken to our team, and evidently there would be a team that would most likely be responsible for the actual cleanup. Our first responders would simply ensure that nobody goes in there if there is some kind of incident. So more kind of a crowd control aspect for it. But again, you know, where these are located, these teams, how long it's going to take them to deploy, that's something that's kind of up in the air. And I think largely from kind of our perspective here is, you know, what would the regulatory framework look like? Again, that's really kind of up in the air. There is an existing framework for, again, large scale power plants, but whether or not that's applicable to this one, likely it wouldn't be. That's quite an involved process. They have an exclusion area around them. It's quite a bit more, and I go into detail there if you want a little bit more detail about down below. But likely that would have to be adopted to something else in order to allow these to be deployed in kind of a smaller framework like this. So the provinces have had a number of kind of specific plans in those documents. If you look at it, you can see Alberta's. It's very high level, so at this point doesn't really give a whole lot of, you know, direction to us as a municipality. Really just focuses on the high level goals and the benefits, and then again reiterates that commitment to engagement, both from municipalities and then residences as well. Oh yeah, and then the last part, it does mention that Alberta Utilities Commission and Alberta Energy Regulator are kind of working with the national regulator right now. So it's likely that they would be involved in that somehow. But again, how our role in that, it isn't quite clear. So that concludes my presentation. I know not a lot of concrete information, but hopefully there was something there. And again, there are a number of other links available to all these documents. If you'd like to go down that rabbit hole. This concludes my presentation, and happy to take any questions.
Because I don't want to spend all the time reading that. We'll eventually get to it. Do these reactors work on the same principle that they need lots of water? Because if it needs lots of water, we sort of preclude the ability to have one. Like, so I don't know if it's totally, but like in Bruce in Ontario, it's on the Great Lakes. It produces a massive amount of steam energy and all that kind of stuff, which is pushed back into the lake and that kind of stuff. I just wondering if you know if it's totally different technology that.
Through the chair, no. As far as I know, it's the same thing. It heats the water and then the steam spins the turbine. So.
I think, and I won't be able to find it really quickly, I think there is some technology with a really quick Google, I'm seeing like an eVinci microreactor that doesn't require water. I think there are some technologies that use different compounds or different elements in the cooling systems
like
that don't require water.
Like parts of Alberta wouldn't have a problem. You go to northern Alberta and you've got lots of lakes and everything like that. Here, I'm thinking I want my water for drinking as opposed to, you know, making electricity.
Yeah, it's definitely a consideration and something I've thought about as well, like that could preclude many different types of development in this region. I guess my main question with this is there merit in starting like some proactive integration into our land use bylaw, or is it premature based on where sort of provincial legislation and regulations are at?
Yeah, through the chair, I would think it would be premature because just thinking of the Alberta Energy Regulator and AUC process, so for example with renewables, under 619 of the MGA, if they make a decision, then we have to then amend our bylaw in order to comply with that. Right. So I think we would have to definitely kind of see how that works before, because it could be a situation where we do that and then we just have to change it back based on whatever their new ruling is.
Yep.
Yeah,
that totally makes sense. I think this is excellent background and context for us to just start thinking about this and be prepared. There is the future potential possibility where one of our current industrial developments may want to integrate an SMR into their current operation, and I think it's good that we start to have some foundational understanding of the implications of that. So definitely appreciate the work on this, and if you do become aware of something where it would make sense for us to start looking at this, if you can just bring it back to council's attention would be great. Any other questions? Perfect. Well, thank you for the thoroughness again. We appreciate it and
Thank you.
appreciate the resources.
No problem.
Let's move to agenda item 2.8.
Dave from administration again. On page 101 of your agenda package is a system to track users of facilities. And this came up as a request from the town of Drumheller. We provided Chris funding to the town in 2020, and they're looking to have funding again. And this council just started a discussion around the methodology for collecting data on users of facilities in Drumheller. So a motion came up to research a system to track the users in these facilities. And the report just provides some opportunities, some challenges, the technology and costs, and some legislative considerations around a program like this. There is, I guess, the technology to track users of a fob or a key or a card, and just some of the logistics and the information required to set up a program like that. So I guess I'm providing that information and can answer any questions that council may have around that.
Excellent. Thank you. Any questions regarding the report on tracking?
Sounds like there are limitations to using this, and we wouldn't necessarily get the kind of fulsome information I think we're looking for. And I can think, if you're going to a pool and you're paying to go in, that's one thing, but going in to use an arena, there's no, like you've identified here, there's no point where you, so I don't know if, I know surveys are a terrible thing that nobody responds to, but I wonder if we'd be better off just sending a survey to our residents with a list of surrounding facilities. Do you use the Drumheller Arena pool, whatever? Do you use standard arena, whatever? Do you use, if you just had a survey like that you could, I mean, it's not perfect either. I don't know there's no great answer, I don't think, but if we wanted to get some details, I'm not sure that this would do it, and the cost, I don't think would give us like the exact numbers that we're kind of hoping for.
But it would give really good information. Like if we just go in this area here, if we could get the numbers of the people that use, say, the swimming pool in Strathmore, you could then set a number. The number of people that use the libraries in Strathmore, the number of people that use, like, I could see it being you, like you swipe something like even at the transfer station, you could figure out, like where and it wouldn't have to be, it'd just, sort of be land location. You could figure out how far people are traveling that in order to get rid of their garbage and that kind of stuff. I think it would be, I mean, it's a big number, but information I don't think there is such a deal as having too much information, and being able to be fair and when you're giving funds to different municipalities, that having those numbers, they'd be concrete. The number jumps out, it's a lot of money. So I'd have to think about it, but I would hope that we just don't throw it by the wayside. I think we need more discussion on this, on the potential to, I mean, it doesn't have to, have my SIN number and all that kind of stuff on there. Just, just even land location, right? Like, and that kind of stuff. So that you could just say, well, okay, because we might be surprised that, that there's a whole bunch of people from the the Dallam area that uses the pool in Strathmore, for an example. I don't know if that's the case or not, but you might, so therefore, maybe we're not giving the town of Strathmore enough money because we have more users than we think. And because we have tried ever since I've been on council, to get solid numbers on what and who is using. It'd be good to know who's using our facilities, right? So I really like the idea, don't like the price, but I'd be willing to further try to figure out how this would work.
So just looking at the core, like, rationale for exploring this is data. And I know we've had ongoing conversations with the town of Strathmore. At one point, we were told data was being compiled. I think I have a letter, like a historic letter, probably 5 years old or something, saying that data was being collected. And then in further discussion, data had not been collected, if I'm recalling correctly. For this current situation, and I'll let Deputy Reeve Clausen jump in as well, through conversations with Mayor Kohlberg, I believe Drumheller is at least starting to collect some more detailed data on usage, for example, at their pool. But interesting discussions around hockey and that type of thing. That might be able to be done rather than on a per use. You could look at potentially, if this is useful, looking at like the teams and where the players are from, and it would sort of be a one-time, like we have these 8 teams that have ice time booked at this arena, and 17% of players are from Wheatland County. Like that would just be looking at 8 teams once for a season, or I'm just totally pulling numbers out. Mayor Kohlberg did indicate it's detailed information, so they're not just taking postal codes, for example, because that can be challenging. For a long time, I had an address that said Strathmore, just in my mailing address. I don't know how detailed the postal codes were at that time, but she did say that they are taking down specific addresses. And I believe, if I recall correctly, I'd have to look at my notes, but specifically asking, are you a resident of the municipality of, I forget Drumheller exactly what it's called, but, or from a county or that type of thing. Recognizing that some residents aren't even always clear, like what municipality they might live in. But so there was a very much an openness and a willingness, and she did comment that they were already collecting that. I do appreciate administration pointing to some of the other methodology we could look at as well, with service catchment areas, average of cost sharing agreements in other regions, which we have utilized in one of our more recent agreements, and then general population demographics. There might even be a way, as these discussions flesh out, to combine that with something like what Councillor Laprise has raised with around a survey or something like that, to give us maybe a bit more detailed data. Because I think we have identified in the past that we have ratepayers that utilize recreation facilities for sure in a number of different municipalities, whether it's the villages, an adjacent rural municipality, or in a town or city. So they're complex questions, and obviously where it comes into play is when we get into those cost sharing conversations. We want those to be, at least from my perspective, I do want fair cost sharing, and it's just finding a mechanism to support that gives us evidence-based decisions. So for me, there's too many risks with a FOB type system, whether it's, you did a great job of identifying some of the challenges in implementing it. But I do think there's value in that data. It's just how do we get it and approach cost sharing from a fair perspective. Deputy Reeve Clausen attended just a preliminary meeting with the mayor of Drumheller, the Reeves of Starland, Nehill, Wheatland, and I believe Special Areas was represented as well. Deputy Reeve Clausen, did you have anything you wanted to update from that meeting? I wasn't available for the meeting.
No, thanks. It was the same situation we're dealing with any of these rec things, is how do you get the right data? And when you do catchment areas and all that kind of stuff, then you need a consultant or you need staff time. it'd be nice if the province came up with a formula that we'd use for everybody and just plunk the numbers in, but it's left up to us to do it. So I like as much hard data as we can get. So when you look at hiring consultants and things like that, really this program isn't that expensive, because if you look at how many neighboring municipalities we have that could possibly have some rec agreements with us, it'll add up pretty fast. So, you know, maybe the technology is not there now, but I see it at some point in the future. It's the only fair way to do it. Like, we just hear other information about our residents attending other facilities, and you know, they want XYZ for this or that, and how do you back that up? It's somebody's opinion. When they collect that data, you always question what the source is. So a machine doesn't make a mistake, but that's all I was thinking on there. I'd like to still go down this road a little bit further and try to narrow it down into something that is legally usable. Like I could see something divisionally for people where you know, my division utilizes Strathmore in this area. Then you know where your population migrates. We're so vast. That's where I was hoping to come up with some good information. And then you got something you're able to negotiate with, some actual data.
I don't think I'd really support going down this road. I just feel like you might have the technical data on a fob, but it's still a person using it, and you're still reliant on them doing it appropriately. And I could see lots of people not wanting to share that information, and so I just don't think that you might think you're getting accurate data, but I don't think you would be.
I would agree
I've
with
seen this
Councillor
used in,
Laprise. This isn't, there might be a value to adding data, but this is not the way to do it.
Councillor Kester and then Deputy Reeve Clausen.
I personally think there's going to be a pushback from our residents being tagged with a fob. And I question the reasoning for just collecting data, say, well, we'll just use the swimming pool. There's the cost of opportunity, the cost of it being there. So if a ratepayer moves into, wants to pick Wheatland County, or wants to pick special areas, well, I like Wheatland County because there's a swimming pool close by, or there's 3 of them, or 4. It's no different than in the Strathmore. There's 14,000 people, but only 1,000 go swimming. 14,000 pay for it. It's a piece of their pie. 2,000 go skating and the rest don't. That's how they pay for it. The county, we're used to not paying for anything. And I guess maybe we have to be the ones that get into the 21st century and rationalize. Do our residents want to participate in something? Realizing they're not going to participate in everything, but they're going to do something. And realizing that there are people in the centers that are going to come into the county and participate, either renting our arenas or just going for a drive in the country or a walk. I think a positive move on our part was down in the Carsland area where we want to construct these walking paths. It's just not going to be for the people in that area of the county. There's going to be people from Vulcan come here and want to walk down there. I think if we're going to spend money for fobs that nobody's going to like, I might end up eating a couple of them, and I'm not in favor of them. No.
Not enough ketchup for that.
No. I think we have to maybe reassess is it data, the people that are actually using it? Or is it the opportunity we should be thinking of too, the access to it?
Deputy Reeve Clausen.
Yeah, I know this technology has actually been currently used for well over 10 years in Rocky View School Division. All the kids on the bus, every student has it. As soon as they get on the bus in the morning, it's attached to their backpack. They scan in. It's not, it's to track for accidents and things like that. If a parent phones in and says, where's their kid? They know exactly where they're at up to the second. So I don't know how they've gotten away with doing it, but they've done it for years. So, and I think Golden Hills was in the process of doing it a couple of years back too. So the kids are used to it. They've seen it. And I thought there'd be a big push back then, but I was there when all that stuff was put in and the kids just adapted to it like nothing. So it's there. It's utilized, but I can understand people are hesitant about it. But that's all I'll say.
So definitely hearing diversity of perspectives. I think it's good to have this context information. And then I think maybe we can just keep this in context as we move forward with cost sharing discussions, both with Drumheller and with the town of Strathmore. And we have this background information, and we can sort of circle back to this as we further the discussions around cost sharing, if that works for everybody. We do appreciate the work on the context. It's helpful knowing some of the costs associated with that method. So thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions or discussion on that one? Well, that actually concludes our work for today. So we finished. I'm actually pleasantly surprised. So that concludes our agenda. I will adjourn our meeting. We'll see everybody at council next week. Thank you.
Thank you.